right, hey everyone. I'm Tom, head of engineering at Rasa, and I'm very proud to present a couple things that we've been working on. And me, that is really kind of the whole Rasa team and kind of the extended Rasa team, so all the heroes, all the contributors, all the people that kind of are part of the community and that have been kind of working on our products. But before we kind of look at our features, we're just going to take a quick look back at May. So we've released Rasa 1.0 there and Rasa X, and it's been a blast for us, right? We got so much feedback for our Rasa X release. I mean, it's freely available, and there's just so much feedback coming in, and we're really looking forward to kind of developing that further and making it even easier to analyze conversations using Rasa X. And since May, a lot has happened, right? So there's been 2,000 commits over that. More than 100 contributors added code to Rasa, and we closed more than 500 issues. So that's really a team effort to go through all of them, answer questions, go through bugs, go through feature requests. Really happy to be working on there. And now we've just released Rasa 1.3 and also Rasa X 0.21. So that release made it out the door this morning. So we're really happy to kind of get that into your hands and to try it out, to play around with it, and kind of take a look at the new features that we've added there. And the focus for these releases are really developer workflows. So that's something we've been working on really intensively for the past, and we'll look into it. And you will see that's also going to be a large topic for the near future. And we really looked into how to build bots, how to improve that, how to kind of improve the experience there. And also, once you've built a bot, right, you need to take a look at conversations. You want to annotate new training data and kind of improve the performance of your machine learning model. And the last step is also kind of bringing that into production, right? It's not enough to kind of just spin it up somewhere. You need to make sure your bot is running, it's kind of able to handle the load of your users, and kind of not going down at some point. So let's take a closer look at these different categories, and I'm going to highlight a couple features. There's just really a selection. There's lots. The changelog has been huge, so this is just really a quick highlight. So one thing that we looked into is how to integrate domain knowledge. So usually you have your chatbot, and then you have a large base of knowledge, right? So that includes your database. For example, in a concierge bot, that could be fetching additional information about a result. So if we take a look here, the bot, in this case, that human on the right, on the left, said, I found Lua restaurant in Dana. Should I reserve a table for one of these? And the user answers, what cuisine is the first one? And that's actually a tricky response, right? You need to figure out what first one means, right? Which restaurant that is referring to. And you also need to query an attribute for that particular restaurant. And this is pretty common in kind of dialogues. So we wanted to make that easier. And here's a quick walkthrough on how that can look like. So you can see a domain here. I hope you can see it a little. So it's a list of restaurants. So this is an adjacent file. It's our knowledge base. And it contains a couple of restaurants, each of them with a name and a cuisine. And that is kind of a database we can use when talking to our bot. And here you can see kind of the change we need to make to our domain. So we'll add a special intent, which is called query knowledge base. And that is kind of the catch-all for all these phrases like what cuisine has a specific restaurant. We can also customize some of the phrases the bot is using to ask for certain information. And there's one custom action we need to implement. And that custom action is kind of really driving that knowledge base integration. But first, let's take a look at the NLU training data. So there's a lot going on here, lots of different entities. So in the first example, we have what restaurants can you recommend, and we can see the object type restaurant. So this is referring to our knowledge base. So you could also have object type hotel, for example, integrating multiple different knowledge bases. And another example is what cuisine is it. In this case, we have cuisine as a normal attribute, and it as kind of a mention, and we kind of need to resolve that mention to an actual restaurant later on. And our custom action that actually implements this knowledge base is super simple in this case. So it really just loads our knowledge base, in this case, really just from a JSON file, and all the magic happens in that action query knowledge base. And this is our implementation, but you can customize that as much as you want. So for example, you can customize utter functions on using different messages or on how to react on certain input from a user. But we try to kind of give you a base implementation to work from. And if we want to try that out, we need to spin up our action server, right, to run that custom action we just saw. And then we can use Rasa shell to send a message to that bot. So what restaurants can you recommend? And the bot responds with a list. And then we can ask, for example, what cuisine is the last one? And that custom action will go, query the knowledge base, resolve that mention, and then kind of make sure that we see the result. And that's actually a huge topic, so I can't go through all the details, but it's part of our documentation, so please take a look at the details there. And we also added a blog post about it on kind of more of the machine learning details as well. So really feel free to take a look at our blog there to get more of the machine learning details. Another thing we've been looking into to make it easier to build bots is response generation. So a common theme is the question on how to handle chit-chat and FHQs. And the common thing is that they are single-turn interactions. So the user asks one message, and the bot responds with one message, and then that interaction is kind of done. But there's lots of them, right? So we have what's our name in this case, or how are you? And if you want to build that with Rasa before the current release, you would need to create an intent for each of them. You would need to create an utterance for each of them. And doing that all separately kind of is quite an effort in creating stories especially. So we've changed that and kind of created a new model that can kind of predict these responses. And we can take a look at the NNU training data here. We can see 3 different intents, and all of them start with chit-chat /, and that's kind of something that we've added. So actually all of these different intents map to the same one. It's just chit-chat. And then we have the subcategories /greets /goodbye that kind of a specific model is going to pick up and use later on. But our intent model is really just going to predict chit-chat, which makes story creation a lot easier, right? Previously, you would have kind of the greet intent there. You would have utter greet as a response in the first example. If you take a look at the second story, it would have been goodbye and then utter goodbye, so one story kind of for each of these interactions. Now you would have just chit-chat and respond chit-chat, right? And that chit-chat could have been greet, it could have been goodbye, so covering multiple kind of possible interactions. But we need a little bit more information, right? We still need the responses. And this is kind of a new training data file we've added. Well, we're still kind of figuring out a little on how to handle the training data, but that's kind of the format we've gone for now. It's an experimental feature, as well as the kind of the knowledge base integration. So really give your feedback about how this works out for you. So the machine learning model is actually going to take these interactions here. They look a lot similar to stories. So you have kind of the intent there, chit, chat, greet, and then we have the response, which is hey in the first example, or goodbye, see you soon in the second one. And the machine learning model is actually going to predict which of these responses is appropriate given the intent chit-chat. So it's going to take a look at the whole message and then predict the most appropriate response based on that. So in our interaction, it would look like this. So we could do hello, and the bot would respond with hey. We could use are you a bot, and the bot would respond with I am a bot powered by Rasa. And all of these interactions would lead to the same intent, which is chit-chat. But then our response generation model would actually take a look at and pick the right response from the list that we've provided. And as I said, that's experimental, and we've created a blog post around that as well, so kind of looking more at the machine learning model and how we implemented it. So do take a look at that blog post as well. It's a really good read. And the third feature I want to highlight is the response editor in Rasa X. There's lots of features we've added to Rasa X to make it easier to use together with Rasa. So we've added regexes, we have added lookup tables, so things that you could do in Rasa beforehand, but that were tricky in combination with Rasa X. And an additional feature is the response editor. So how can you create great responses in Rasa X? We have our own format here, right, that probably most of you know. There we go. And kind of creating these responses in our custom format is sometimes a bit tricky. So we wanted to make that easier. And in this case, you can see all the responses listed here, and then you can edit one. You can change the text. And the cool feature is that you get a live preview of how that looks like. So you can change the text, you can make it a bit more fun and add buttons, for example, to make it easier for your user to reply. So in this case, we can add book restaurant or book hotel. And yeah, really the benefit is that kind of you see the output as the user would see it as well. It would render obviously a little different depending on kind of, is it Facebook or is it a messenger that you're integrating with, but this should give you a good idea of how it looks like. And you can also add images, of course, to kind of see the whole experience. So yeah, that wraps up kind of the build features, so lots of new stuff there. And now I want to go kind of and take a closer look at improve. And like a key feature there is multi-story graphs. So we have been using visualizations for stories before, right? We did that on the command line. We did that in interactive learning in Rasa, and we've also added them to Rasa X. And all of that is kind of focusing on how to get an overview of a bot's capability. So how can you make sure you know what your bot is gonna do? So let's take a quick look at the demo there. And the key feature here is that we're now able to not only generate a graph for the whole data set or a single story, but we can see the visualization for a single story on that end. But you can also select multiple stories and then kind of see how these stories interact, how they getting combined. And then in the future, there's lots of more information we could add here, right? We could add, for example, which paths users take, which are kind of most common flows users go through, where do users drop off. So kind of this is kind of the basis for a lot of new features we're looking into. And the last category is deploy, and that's actually quite a tricky one, right? There's lots of different ways to deploy Rasa, lots of different ways to spin up a server, right? You can use Docker, you can do it on bare metal, and we want to support all of that. Our focus has been on Docker and kind of scaling within, for example, Kubernetes. And we want to make sure that really all of your users can use your bot and enjoy it concurrently. And to make that easier, it's now rather straightforward to kind of spin up a load balancer, right, in your preferred cluster, have kind of multiple people talking to that load balancer, distribute the incoming messages to different Rasa instances, and then these instances handle the conversations. Actually, Rasa and Rasa Core and NLU, both parts are quite stateless, right? So they read in the conversational state, then they do some magic in processing and machine learning, and then they output actions and run stuff. But the whole state is kind of covered in the tracker store. So what we've added is kind of a log store to make sure that no concurrent Rasa instances are working on the same conversation. So let's say a user sends two messages right after one another. We want to make sure that they are handled one after another, and that not like two instances are processing these messages in parallel, kind of losing state across these processes. Yeah, so that kind of covers that whole flow, and kind of, as I said, it's sort of just a pick of some of the features that we've been working on, then the community contributed. So the question is, what is next? So what is it that we're looking into as one of the next big challenges? And I've already been talking to a couple people around at the venue. So as I said, developer workflows is super important for us to make it really easy to build chatbots, to make it easy to go from development into production. And part of these workflows is Git, right? And all the developers are working with Git. They store training data there. They store code there. And then moving from that Git storage, we usually kind of connect that to CI, to Travis, Circus CI, whatever, kind of building your code, testing it, making sure your code performs. And the last stage is usually continuous deployment, so kind of spinning up servers in a staging area or even your production servers. And that is actually quite a tricky workflow for people working with Rasa or with machine learning models in general. Because you not only need to keep track of code, you need to keep track of code, training data, conversations users have with your bot to kind of use that as future training data, and also models, right? So all of these different pieces need to be kept track of and used for kind of the final deployment. And we want to make that a lot easier. Working together with Rasa X, kind of making sure the training data is always stored, for example, in Git, but still allowing kind of people to annotate data in Rasa X, kind of adding new training data, and that's a kind of a tricky thing to balance. There's also lots of other topics we're looking into. So end-to-end models is a large research topic. Data annotation and insight generation in general. So which conversations should you add to the training data? Which conversations are going well, are not going well? And definitely ease of use. So what do you need to kind of configure in NLU and kind of or in Rasa in general? And what happens automatically? So lots of different topics we want to look into, but I want you to focus on that one for today. So kind of talk to me about your developer workflows. Where do you store training data? How do you test your models? I'd love to hear more about your workflows. It's super important, and we really want to make sure that kind of that integrates very well with Rasa and Rasa X. So yeah, thanks a lot. That was kind of my input, and I'd love to hear your input later in chatting with you. Yeah, I think we have some time for a couple more questions, if you have any. Yep.
Since Rasa is an open source project, I was wondering if you have any areas where you're seeking contributors.
Oh, yeah. Very good question. I think Jutta will talk about that later as well in the community update. But we have a board on GitHub that we kind of try to keep updated, adding more issues that we like to see contributions for. So things that we think are super valuable for everyone, but that we can't work on ourselves because there's lots of other things we need to do. So that is really cool GitHub project board. Maybe I can even show you that board. So if you go to GitHub Rasa HQ, and you go to projects, you can see contribute to Rasa, and there's lots of open issues that we'd really like to see contributions for. So there's obviously code, there's also support and other issues. So it kind of depends a little on what you want to work on. Yeah. Sure.
Are you working on zero downtime deployment or model migration? Let's say V1 had a slot name and V2 had a slot first name and last name, and we're now deploying. We used to have V1, now we're deploying V2. So is that something you're thinking about in continuous deployment?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple issues, right? I mean, there's first zero downtime. So how can you kind of spin up a new instance without kind of losing conversations or delaying any ongoing chats with users? And the current setup already supports that, so you can hot reload models, and they will kind of take over. There's also different setups you can go for. I know that lots of other companies have set it up more in a Dockerized fashion, where you kind of build a Docker container that includes the model. So you would build kind of a new Docker container every time you train a new model or push a new model into production. And that works really well with the common Kubernetes workflows, for example, spinning up a new service, waiting until the new service is ready, and then kind of pulling down the old model. But I think something important you mentioned as well is kind of model incompatibility, so kind of adding new slots. And that's something we're not working on right now, but I think it's a super important topic for Rasa X because we collect all the training data there, and we will have old training data, or not old training data, but old conversations that kind of use an earlier model, and we'll have conversations in there for a new model that kind of has additional slots, and maybe new conversations aren't faulty, but old conversations are. And that is, I guess, again, something we're working on, right? So which conversations should you look into to add new training data? Obviously, more recent conversations that failed are more important than old conversations that failed, right? Because your model might have evolved. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic. We can definitely talk about that later as well. Any more? Yep.
What is your plan? So what is your plan to handle the data security while we're storing the conversation data in our database?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
About your data security?
Yeah.
So do you have any plans to handle that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the data is right now on-premise, right? So you run the database, all the conversations are stored where you run your database. So hopefully that is in a secure data center or even on-premise in a machine stored in a cabinet. And what we are looking into is kind of when we expose that information with Rasa X, with role-based access control, making sure we kind of have a fine-grained way to say these people are allowed to see the training data, for example, these people are allowed to see conversations that people have with the bot. So that's something that we have in Rasa X. And that kind of should allow you to handle the data really secure.
But most of the time, whenever we use
You can take it offline.
Yeah, we can talk later about that as well. All right, I think I need to wrap up. So thanks a lot for all the questions. And I'll be around. Lots of other Rasa people will be around as well. And I'd love to talk to you.